So, I have a new map to show off today. It is directions, winds, pillars, basically deities of the four winds in various pantheons around the globe. From Europe, we have a few. Then we have a little bit in the Middle East, not very many. Then there's India and China, which are closely linked. And then we have some in the Americas, both North America and Central America. We will have these lines showing what culture it is and a kind of central location of that general culture. In this case, Sioux, for example, near the Missouri River. There will be four directional deities, and they will be colored based on explicit coloration, which many of them have, most of them have. Hopefully that's intuitive. If you look at the table, the two things I'm kind of looking for is, like I said, the direction and the color. Pause the video right here to look at what we'll be covering. Not everything will be covered entirely. The way I organize it here is it's not as simple as directions universally, because everywhere in the world doesn't have the same climate, and so some of the winds associated usually with different kinds of weather and different climate and different seasons are not going to be the same everywhere. So instead of going by a simple like north, south, east, west coding system here, I have cold, wet, hot, and dry, which seems to be a bit more universal, more applicable. Let's start with the Mediterranean complex. So this is mostly Greek influence, because the Romans mostly adopted the Greek format as well. But there's three different layers here. There's the Titan pillars, the four pillars holding up the sky. There's the Greek anemoi, wind spirits, and there's the Roman venti, wind spirits. Those are basically identical. Coincidentally, Eos Aurora is associated with the east and the morning star, Venus, and Astraeus is associated with the west and the evening star. Those two partners are the parents of the anemoi and the winds. So it's interesting that those layers kind of meet up here. The four pillars holding up the four corners of the earth, north, south, east, and west, are typically said to be the Iapetus, Hyperion, Coeus, and Crius. And that mostly stayed true, except over here in the west, Astraeus sometimes is said to have upheld the world, and then Atlas eventually takes over as upholding the western pillar. But in general, by the time Atlas is talked about, he's kind of treated as the one holding up just the pillar. The western pillar ends up being like the only one that's really talked about. Then you have these minor deities I put here, Vesper, Phosphorus. Those are just the east and the west, the morning star and the evening star gods. And since Venus is involved here between east and west, which makes sense, I've also involved two other planets that are associated with Crius and Coeus. That would be Hieris, which is Mars, and Stilbon, which is Mercury. So sometimes the planets can be correlated with the winds. And these, of course, would be the inner planets, not the outer planets, Jupiter and Saturn. And so the color choices I went with, of red being south, has to do with fire or warm or heat. Black being north has to do with the dark, the winter, cold. Blue in the west has to do with the moisture, the wetness, the weather. White in the east has to do with the dry air, continental sort of air coming in. When we look more specifically now at the anemoi, we see that the north, Boreas or Aquilo, is associated with cold, of course, because that would be winter. Favonius and Zephyr are considered the favorable wind, which is a good, somewhat dry, cool wind coming in from the west. Eurus Volturnus and Notus Auster are stormy winds. Each of them is stormy because in both those directions come rain and storms that sometimes damages crops. The southern one, you might be surprised, you would think maybe heat, Well, heat in the Mediterranean and in many places causes great storms. And these storms were particularly disastrous and damaging to crops. Eurus Volturnus also sometimes considered kind of rude. He's also associated sometimes with Zeus or Jupiter himself, so think of that. But the color associations here are not as direct in the Greek and Roman sources. I had to dig a little deeper. I found two different layers to look at when associating colors. One is the sacrifice of black or white lambs to these wind deities, and the second layer is poetry that often refers to certain colors or emphasizes certain colors. And that one's a little more loose. The Greeks and Romans would sacrifice lambs to the wind gods. They sacrificed white lambs to the favorable, good winds to keep them appeased, to keep them coming. And then they would sacrifice a black lamb to the less favorable, more disastrous, more problematic winds. And it turns out that Zephyr or Favonius was the only one that they sacrificed any white lambs to. So basically he was the favorite. That's why he's Favonius. That's why he's favorable. And all the other ones were considered unfavorable. All of them brought storm or cold or wind or things that would just make it kind of miserable. The poetic layer, however, sometimes treats Volturnus or Uranus as having to do with red in association with seemingly the east, the dawn, which is the color of the sky when the sun is rising. Auster or Notus associated with gray and brown, the kind of muddy colors that they associate with the kinds of storms and deluges that they bring. Also like the sheer humidity that they represent. He's kind of got a shaggy gray beard. Favonius has an additional association with gold and green colors because these are like floral colors. His partner is Chloris or Flora, the floral goddess. And he himself represents kind of spring. Then Aquilo or Boreas associated usually with black, the darkness of winter, cold, and also a few different poetic colors, purple and blue, which are like bruising, that color that you get if you get frostbite, that kind of thing. So yes, here is the Mediterranean complex. So next, let's take a look at the Northern European complex. This includes Baltic, Lithuanian, Prussian spelled wrong there, and Norse. So in the Norse system, it's also pillars upholding the sky, and the four pillars in the four directions are dwarves or dark elves, and each was associated with an element, effectively. Cold in the north, hot in the south, dry in the east, and wet in the west. Njord and Aegir are also something to note here because both of them, sometimes interchangeable with one another, even though they're slightly distinct, are associated with the north and also kind of sea. And this Baltic North Sea conduit, there's a coupling of the northern wind god with a sea god. That's what Aegir and Njord kind of represent. There's also an interesting linguistic potential connection that someone could look into about Aegir, Aguijas, which means, aqua, and Aquilo. Baltic is a little more complex. There are a few different layers. So there's the typical Lithuanian or really Prussian four winds. Again, this dynamic of dry, wet, cold, and warm. We've also got the morning star and evening star here. These are female. These ones here are male, however, this morning star and this evening star here. And then Zeazdrea is Mars down here. And in a slightly later layer, these names, so the winter one, the southern one here, then the sea one and the earthy one. Really interesting thing about that dimension that is added is Zeminus means earthy, Drui means sea. It's referring to the marine climate and the continental climate, which is really fascinating because that is exactly kind of the wording that you would use for differentiating between the wet and the dry systems. I'm also a geographer with a background in geoscience, by the way, so That sort of thing is very much up my alley. Then in this later system, they also have sometimes diagonal wind deities. These would be Ozinus, Cygnus, Somus, and Austrinus. Austrinus is the most interesting of those because she is either Asteros, the morning star deity, or Osrine, the morning star goddess. It's like Eos and Eros, basically. In fact, Asteros is the son of Osrine, just like Eros is the son of Eos, Aphrodite. Another similar structure that's coming up here, we can see it with Njord and Aegir, almost pattern-wise, if they're not literally the parents of the dwarves, which they're not. Bangputis and Veopatis are the leaders and parents of the Four Winds in Baltic mythology. So that right there resembles a pattern that we're going to start seeing in a few different places. So let's pull on that thread right now. It's going to bring us east. If we look at Bangputis and Veopatis, the Wind Father, presumably has an Indo-European origin, especially between the Eastern Indo-European, which Balto-Slavic and Indo-Aryan are part of, appears in Iranian as Vayuvata and then as Vayu. That brings us into the Indian system. So Vayu in this system is considered one of the diagonal wind gods. A later system or layer, he is associated with the northwest, which is coincidentally the direction that he would have come to India from originally, which is kind of interesting, and also still holds that northerly position. The main wind deities in the Vedic, Hindu, and Buddhist system are the Lokapalas. That would be over here Virupaksha in the west, Datta in the east, Kubera in the north, and Virudhaka in the south. So you can see in the framework as a whole, each one of these deities is associated with a region in India that climatically resonates with that deity. So Virudhaka is the green god. Blue and green are about to be very mixed in a lot of the stuff we're looking at. Consider blue and green sometimes to be the same. Down here, Dravidia is bridging into the tropics. They have a lot of monsoons. It's very green down there. It's dry over here where the fiery west wind is. It's wet over here as well, where Datta is associated with, but also the mountains and things like that. And then the north mountains, the Himalayas, the kind of homeland of the gods at Mount Meru up here, Kubera is associated. And he's yellow because he's originally gold, and that refers to the wealth of the earth, the wealth of the mountains. It's also important to note, I think, that Kubera, whose other name is Vice Ravana, is the brother of Ravana, and Ravana is the 10-headed demon man of the Ramayana. They're both children of Vishrava. So sometimes Vishrava or Kubera or his other name Visravana are all associated with this golden northern mountain deity. Last note I'll make is that on the transference to Buddhism, Datta, who originally was yellow in the Vedic system, because gold is Kubera, becomes white, and that's Datarata in Buddhism. Another quick final note about these four is that 3 out of 4 of them, not including Datta, are depicted deformed or dwarfish or giant in some way. And each of them kind of rules over a different class of wild demigod beings. Even Datta is the ruler of the Gandharvas, and they are sometimes depicted with rooster or centaur-like features. Virudhaka rules over gnomes and forest spirits, so that's an interesting note when we were kind of looking back at the Titans and the dwarves or dark elves in the European systems. So now let's follow these lines here from Buddhist India into Buddhist China. And this is not merely Buddhist China. There's a Buddhist influence at the end of each of these 5 deity complexes. But China seems to have had an original system that is somewhat distinct from the Hindu system. So we can see here that Guangmu is the West Chinese Buddhist version of Virupaksha, so he's the fire god. Zhangjiang is the green growing Virudhaka. Shiguo is the upholder Datarata, and Pishamontian is the direct translation of Vaisravana. So those are all absolutely adopted from Indian and Tibetan Buddhism. And each of them, you can see, is associated, its colors and its direction, with exactly just copy and pasting the Indian system. And it's kind of interesting because this is an example where simply correlating directions breaks down, because Zhangjiang, for instance, is the growth and green deity in the south, which makes sense because the south of China is very wet and very green. However, in the Chinese system originally, Qingdi and the Qinglong, the Azure Emperor, the Azure Dragon, which Azure is not just blue, it's blue-green, is in the east, not the south originally. And this mountain range here are his patronage. In the Chinese system, the south was actually ruled by the fiery red emperor, Zhurong Qidi, and then the vermilion bird, Zuku, which is a kind of phoenix, effectively. The Azure Dragon, who's essentially the mount or the draconic form of Qingdi, is the Azure Dragon of the East. So each one of these animals here, Chuanwu, Qinglong, Zugu, and Baihu, White Tiger of the West, Black Tortoise of the North, each of those has like a series of constellations in each season, each quarter of the sky in China. Each has a seasonal, a color, and a directional correlation. And each of those animals has a lot of overlap with the emperors from these areas. So we already said Azure Emperor, Red Emperor, then there's White Emperor, Bai Di or Di Jun, and then Hai Di, the Black Emperor of the North. Those colors are quite consistent, and the directions are quite consistent. You can see how when the Indian system comes in, Datarata is forced into the east, even though Zhangjiang is more appropriate, and Qingdi also has some chthonic and earthy connections to him, almost like something of a Yama figure, even though Yama himself also was adopted as Yan Luo in Chinese as the underworld deity. But Qi Guo actually has a lot more in common visually and conceptually with Bai Di as a musician, as this white, pristine, high, kingly god of civic duty and order. That is exactly what the upholder of the Raj, Datarata, ought to be. There's also this form here of Duowen that takes on the characteristics of Haidi and Zhuanwo to a degree, but is considered to be identical with Pishamontian. Whereas in these other systems, there's not really much syncretism going on between these because they're very clearly understood to not really be the same energy. Another interesting note here is that Pishamontian is no longer gold or yellow. He has become green in the Chinese Buddhist system. And part of why that happened is because in China there was already a yellow emperor, and that is Huangdi, the most important central emperor of the directions. So he represents the center. He represents essentially the king of all the directions. China's homeland of the Han itself and the Yellow River. So when they adopted this deity that was associated with wealth and the north and yellow and gold, they had to slant it a little bit, and they ended up syncretizing it with Haidi, the Black Emperor, even though it doesn't quite make perfect sense. There's a lot of things about Vicerovana Kubera that aren't quite compatible exactly with Black Emperor, which has much more like cold winter connotation in China than it does in India. And that's part of why I kind of put this line here. Not to say this is definitive, but my feeling is that Ravana is much more fitting as a character compatible with the Black Tortoise Xuanbo or the Haidi Black Emperor. That his usurpation of Kubera's throne might even explain, from a syncretic perspective, why Wang Di and Haidi are so different. And I've also made a suggestion here that Kubera, in terms of wealth, fortune, the earth, has a lot more in common with the indigenous Chinese deity Kai-Shen. And Kai-Shen has some gold yellow associations sometimes, in line with Wang Di as well, although he's of course treated somewhat separately. The fortune deities is a totally different dimension that goes into Korea and Japan as well, where sometimes they have directional associations and do indeed correlate with these things, especially Kai-Shen with the center and the earth element, which is Huang Di's element. So yes, that is the Indian and Chinese complexes. Next, I'd like to go across the way, and I want to start with Mesoamerica, because I feel like I've always found a lot of the dragon and bestial elements of Aztec and Mayan having some things in common with Chinese. And that would make sense because all or almost all American indigenous groups are descended from 50% ancestral North Eurasian and 50% ancestral East Eurasian. So I suspect that there are deep time correlations between some of these things. They're very explicit about the colors associated with each of these deities and, of course, their directions. The Americas seem to be particularly interested in the four-directional wind deities. It lives on in a lot of symbolism. And I even suspect that a lot of the four winds that we looked at in Europe might descend from a common North Eurasian source. So the Mayan system, by the way, is older than the Aztec system. The Aztecs reached this region from the north after the Mayan civilization kind of had its heyday. And there are at least two other major ethno-linguistic complexes in this area that I'll look into eventually. But right now, I'm just doing these two because these are very mainstream. We can see a clear correlation here with the red god is a harvest deity, a deity of agriculture, actually. Why is he red? Well, the mythology of both Hobnil and Xippitotec is that they are kind of dying and resurrecting gods. So, in some ways, like Yama or Osiris, an agricultural dying and resurrecting deity. In the Aztec system, he's the flayed one. The flayed one literally flayed himself open to feed humankind. So it was a sacrifice for humankind to survive, to live. He's a very benevolent deity. Why the red association? Obviously, the sacrifice, the blood sacrifice aspect of it, but also because he's in the east, it is another one of those things where it's referring to the color of the sky during sunrise. Another quite easy correlation down here, despite the color difference between Hosanek and Huitzilopochtli, is there is still a Thunderbird motif or archetype at the core of these two, in control of storms and rain, and that's where this direction is associated. It's the rainy, wet side. Although, honestly, in this region, bridging into the tropical region, it is very wet in almost every direction, especially for the Maya out here in the Yucatan Peninsula. Nonetheless, we can see a transference of this yellow-coated Thunderbird, the yellow of lightning bolts, transforming or adapting into a turquoise-colored eagle one of the most important symbols for the Aztecs. The Aztecs actually came down into the Mexican Valley, where the Totonac and other peoples actually lived before them, and they saw and followed an eagle, and it was eating or catching a snake on a cactus. And then that's when they knew that they needed to settle down and eventually founded Tenochtitlan there. There's a lot of symbology around the world, but especially here between the Thunderbird and the serpent. The snake part would be Cucumatz in Mayan, which is their rainbow serpent. And then the rainbow serpent that everyone knows, Quetzalcoatl, is Aztec. There seems to have been a rainbow serpent common to all Mesoamericans. So both of those seem to be probably fairly old deities, especially since we see thunderbirds and horned or rainbow serpents throughout the Americas. In the Mayan system, these are pillars again. They're called Bacabs. They are upholding the world, so very much that dwarf and titan motif. The rainbow serpent, Cucumatz, is not part of that dynamic, but he is separately associated with turquoise color and the west, which is interesting. Quetzalcoatl in the Aztec system, however, is associated with white, but still the west. So that's curious and interesting. And the turquoise eagle is turquoise instead of the Mayan rainbow serpent. And I've heard some people thinking about this as like feathered serpent in general represents a synthesis of the bird with the serpent. That's why some of the turquoise correspondences might be shared here. The other clear parallel that we see is the black jaguar, who is indeed one of the Bacabs and is correlated with the north black jaguar or serpent in the Aztec system. He's west in the Mayan and north in the Aztec, which I kind of like how these arrows are pointing in this direction. The agricultural deity is pointing towards the agricultural homeland of the Mesoamerican Neolithic farmers, which is this whole area here. This is where the first agriculture maize took place in Mesoamerica. And then the standout, the one that's so weird, really, is the northern Mayan Bacab, whose white color is explicitly associated with snow. I'm sure most of us could probably guess it doesn't snow very often in the Yucatan. They were correct that further north there would be snow. In fact, that the Mayans have that, but there really is no other straightforward call out to winter and snow. There is a dark aspect to Tezcatlipoca, the black jaguar or serpent, but it is not explicitly the kind of winter that you get a little further north. So yes, that's a very simple look at the Mesoamerican complex. So finally, we're going to look at North America. Essentially, we're going to break this up into two pieces. There's this whole side here, which has a lot of exchange and sharing of concepts and deities. Then over here, separately, is the Pueblo region with the Diné. So these were formerly referred to as the Navajo. They have Nilch'i, a singular wind god that has 4 different faces, 4 different aspects. Diné are part of a larger Diné Athabascan group of people that migrated into the Americas relatively late, before the Inuit, but after most of the other groups. And then they have a morning and evening star deity. He's also both the morning and the evening star. So in both cases, there's a singular, like 2 deities here. One is Venus, and the other one is all the winds. So kind of interesting integrated philosophy there. Their colors are specifically named. And now we can move eastward into the plains with the Lakota Sioux. There are color associations and directional and seasonal associations. The north is white because of snow, because of the cold. So similar to that Mayan example. The west is black, and that's in reference to dusk and night, because that's where the sun sets. The east on the other hand, is yellow and this golden color of dawn and beginnings. Then the south is red and warm and heat, summer. So yeah, so you have winter and summer, a typical pattern throughout the world that we've seen. Then you have the dawn and dusk, a typical other pattern you see. So a little note about the Western deity here is he's a master of rain and thunder and storms, and this makes sense. I am from Minnesota, and I lived in near Fargo for a time, and that was on the plains, the northern plains. And if you live in this region, you know that thunderstorms are powerful, big, monstrous things. And so this is where we're going to see some of these Western deities. Often black is associated not only with the dusk, like I said, but with dark storm clouds, really huge supercells, the kind of stuff that you really only see this extreme in the Great Plains region of North America. Yeah, so he's associated with dusk and death and storms and all of that, almost like a chaotic, destructive deity. Now let's move up towards the largest complex that we're going to talk about, which is the Algonquin, which is Ojibwa, that is Anishinaabe, and Wabanaki, both Algonquin groups, and the Iroquoians, also in this region. Now, the Iroquois are more descended from Mississippians, like the Sioux are. They migrated up the Ohio River Valley and spread agriculture to Algonquin hunter-gatherers. But the Algonquins quickly adopted agriculture, and the Iroquois still kind of lived there, and they traded all kinds of ideas. So trying to untangle exactly which ones of these cultures brought which ideas is kind of difficult. And all of them, of course, are indigenous to America and descended from those common ancestors, as well as both of those groups ultimately originate in the Cascadian kind of Rockies region. Algonquins a little more north, and Mississippians originally were like a little more in the middle part here, moving in. So anyway, one of the first things I'd like to mention is the Eastern deity, Wabun, and he's also associated with the morning star. So this is another one where the planets are getting involved, this time directly with the directions. And in the Anishinaabe Ojibwe system, Wabun is the east, and it's actually the basis of the name Wabanaki, because the Wabanaki are actually in this region and slightly different from the Anishinaabe over here and other central Algonquin groups. But the Anishinaabe were pointing east and had an eastern deity, and it just so happens to be the same name, of course, as the eastern group of Algonquins. He also has an eagle association, which is kind of fun. So we're almost imagining that Mesoamerican turquoise eagle thunderbird thing going on there, although the thunder stuff with Wabun is not quite there. He's more of a youthful dawn god figure. In the north, we have another one that's kind of predictable, the northern winter wind deity, very much like the Sioux that we were just looking at, white association. And both the Wabanaki and the Ojibwa have a name for him. Then, returning to the Anishinaabe system, there's a good complex here that's quite consistent. The western wind deity. In Ojibwe system, Ipangashimok is actually a father of many other important deities and heroic founders. So that's where he most often comes up, but he and many other names for him are actually a western wind deity. And that correlates with these others here in these other systems. Iroquois has the Dajoji, and Dajoji is associated specifically with tornadoes, and again with those black, stormy connotations, and is a panther. So that's the first little code you're seeing here of a black panther or black large cat being associated with the West and weather, right? So we saw that almost down here with Zakami the black jaguar. and Tezcatlipoca as well. Then in the south we have this complex of fertility spring deities, Shawano, Ziguan, and Siguan, all consistently kind of named and related to one another with heat and the summer. There's a few little stories about Ziguan fighting Bibon over basically the Venus goddess. Ziguan basically wins for one half of the year, and Bibon wins for the other half of the year. And that's how the seasons are explained. So that's the Anishinaabe kind of layer. Now let's look at the Iroquois layer, which has a lot of overlap. Then Dajoji is overlapping in theme with this black western deity. Yaoga is the north god associated with the bear, and also the color blue instead of white, because for them, white is Neoga, which is a wind goddess of the south, associated with a fawn or baby deer. Then over here you have a moose in the east, Oyendone. And that's where I have a sneaking suspicion, and it's kind of fun to think about, that the Wabanaki have a very fun deity, Pamola. He's a storm god that appears as a chimera of like a man, a moose, and an eagle. And coincidentally or not, the eagle is associated by the Ojibwe with the east, and the Iroquois associate the moose with the east. And Pamola was a deity of Wabanaki lands, so I put him here as, in some ways, a placeholder or an interesting potential blend that was between these two. And very quickly, in the Cherokee system, these are not explicitly deities, except for arguably the southern one, which has the most common elements with Neoga. So they retain seasonal, directional, and color motifs without necessarily being deified. And I suspect that Neoga seems to translate to this, and Dajoji over here. And why do I suspect that? Because Cherokee is actually an Iroquoian language and culture. They broke off from other Iroquoian groups in the north and headed south towards their homeland in Tennessee and Kentucky. So yes, basically that is the American complex. The very last complex we'll be covering here, because it is so small and relatively weird, is the Middle East. Now, like I said, I suspect a lot of wind god dynamics might be a North Eurasian phenomenon, which is why they appear on every edge of North Asia and those migrations. So in the Middle East, these too might be inherited from that source, since both these cultures, Egyptian and Akkadian, being Afro-Asiatic, are part of the broad West Eurasian core. Nonetheless, there are some things that we can learn from this. The most clear-cut system here is Egyptian, and these aren't explicitly winds. They're the sons of Horus, and each one of them with a different consort of Horus. And yes, these are all the appropriate color assignments and mostly appropriate directions. Each of them has the head of a particular animal: a baboon, jackal, man, and hawk. The hawk one resembles Horus himself in a lot of ways because he's in the west, and this red is the sky at dusk, which is common in Egyptian, that the west is associated with red. He is a psychopomp ferrying the dead into the underworld in the west, right? That's a Horus job, and his son, it seems, fell in his footsteps. Tuamutef with the jackal head resembles Anubis, or some say Set. Some say Set because often Set's conflated with Anubis or with a jackal, even though the Set animal is probably a totally different animal. Nonetheless, being a jackal in the east associated in any way with Set does not seem like a coincidence to me. The Egyptians considered the Semitic people, the Canaanites, to be worshippers of Set. And the Canaanites, when they came in and established the Hyksos dynasty in northern Egypt, adopted Set as their Baal, which is it's a very weird thing to do. But when you consider that Egypt doesn't have really a storm deity in the proper sense, the closest they have is Set, which is a deity of chaos and destruction and disorder. And that was associated with storms a little bit. The white, again, seems to correlate with more of this broader West Asian, white being Eastern thing, having to do with light itself, because of the light of Venus and the light of dawn and of the dawn of creation. And then Imseti is this southern green figure, corresponding with the green valleys and floodplains of the Nile. Hapi, on the other hand, this yellow color is more of like the reeds and the early agriculture of the northern region. He's a god of abundance, and that's a kind of wealth, so there, you can kind of see some of the correspondences broadly there. Now looking at the Akkadian, and I say specifically Akkadian because all these names are Akkadian names, even though there might have been an earlier Sumerian source to these directions, but each direction has a kind of word like cloud, mountain, but they often say favorable or the good normal winds in the north. There's a specific myth where Enki fights the Sutu bird and clips its wings. There's implications that this bird and this whole thing was associated with cloud winds, is something of a thunderbird, maybe. And that's a very interesting connection, as part of the reason I went back here is because some of this stuff started to make sense when I went all the way across the world and then back into the Middle East. The west winds were the dry desert winds, as you can see, and they were associated with the traveling shepherd people, the Amorites or the Aramaeans. So Abraham, for instance, was an Aramaean. These were a later wave of northwest Semitic people that came back down into Mesopotamia after the Akkadians. They were part of founding the Babylonian dynasty. So they as a whole were associated with this direction. The interesting thing about that is when you look into the background and history of Amaru as a word, it is a deity as well as the people. It is the name for the people of the West and for the deity of the people of the West. And this deity is closest to El Shaddai and other epithets in Aram and Canaan and Syria. For a mountain deity, probably referring to these mountains, whose oldest form has gazelle connections, but later came to represent shepherdry in general, both goats and sheep. So eventually the ram became one of the symbols of him, and a few other deities like him that went the other direction, like Amun, and so on. There was a fiery shepherd ram figure in the West that corresponds with, in some ways, what Virupaksha represents, the dry west fiery wind, but also Agni, who is effectively an equivalent for the ram-coated fiery messenger god. And here he's the southeast wind, but nonetheless you could see that these motifs of a fiery god with the ram is very consistent. And if you know anything about astrology and the sign Aries, it starts to make a lot of sense. That is a motif that goes back quite far. Iltanu over here is quite a mystery. The north wind is just called the most favorable wind because it's like kind of dry and cool. And if you're living in this region, dry, cool wind is quite nice. They considered this dry, hot wind to be really bad. And they considered this southern cloudy wind to also sometimes be pretty bad, to be pretty damaging. That's why it was given a kind of demonized bird form. Iltanu was associated specifically with the region of Subartu, which is like the steppes of Urartu right here. So Urartu's here, Sabartu is right here. By the way, none of these have specific color. The colors I chose are based on the closest possible connections. So Iltanu is white because he kind of resembles this peaceful, favorable, dry wind, even if he is indeed a north wind, and maybe that would be a better analogy here. Easily, Sutu could be represented by this turquoise color as well, being a southern cloud bird. The last interesting one is Shadu, and Shadu simply means mountain, so it's the mountain winds, and these are the mountains right here, the Zagros Mountains that they're referring to. In general, these mountains were originally referred to by the Sumerians as the home of the gods. So similar to how the Indians looked at Himalayas here as the home of the gods, the Sumerians saw the Zagros Mountains here as the home of the gods, and all these places, Kur and whatnot, that are the names for the heaven or the mountain of the gods, is here. So if you know anything about Sumerian pantheon, you know that Enlil, the high god of the Sumerians, was a god of the mountain and was a master of the winds. And he doesn't have any explicit wind children like some of the other wind fathers do, but he is nonetheless a wind father of sorts because of his command over the winds. It's a little more complicated in this system, though, because Enlil is not purely a sky-like deity. He is earthy, he has agricultural connections, and he has a lot of wealth associations here and there, too. So I prefer to see him archetypally in line with what Kubera represents. And a totally separate line of reasoning would have us recognize that, one, Enlil shares a lot of traits with Kronos and Saturnus, and was syncretized by the Greeks with them, and El in Canaan, and these also overlap in a lot of ways with Kubera, what he represents, and also with Shiva in India. So that's just a tangent. You can go pull on that thread. It's very interesting if you actually look at things that way. Another note on this is that Shadu Mountain is obviously the same name as El Shaddai and Shadu that the Amorites and Aramaeans and Abrahamic religions referred to as Abraham's name for God before he was Yahweh. And this most likely was referring to whatever this deity was of the Amorites. The funny thing is that you saw the goat connotations as well as the ram ones. Well, Enlil, Kronos, Saturnus, Satyr, all associated with goats. And so you almost see here an interesting pattern where both are mountain gods on east and west, but the eastern one is a goat shepherd and the western one is a sheep shepherd, a true shepherd. So a goat herd versus a shepherd. Not so coincidentally, these are also generally where both of those animals were domesticated. Now, sheep were domesticated a lot further north, more in this region, but goats were domesticated by the Iranian Neolithic peoples over in this region here too. So, interesting. With that, I think we've concluded our journey through the map. Honorable mention is the Gnostic, Judaic, and Christian versions of these winds, which you see in the tarot and various Western mysticism and esotericism. They could not agree on the direction very often, though. It changed quite often throughout the centuries and took on multiple different associations from time to time. But it's still kind of an interesting pattern to look at, especially when we've looked at so many other patterns. The four cherubim, and these are the upholders of the throne of God. So again, we have an upholder thing going on. There's the winged ox or calf. Then there's the eagle or serpent. In some older sources, it was serpent. So again, we're seeing the eagle and the serpent together or being conflated or being opposed, represented in some sense. Then there's the winged lion, so we have a large cat. We've seen that pattern a few times before. And then there's the winged man or angel or originally it was a mandrake, which is a man-shaped plant or root, which is a little less easy to explain, but maybe not, because there are many different wind deities that are kind of the human out of the bunch, or the normie out of the bunch, you might say. Take with that what you will. Thanks for spending some time with me looking through this complex web of wind deities. I hope you found this helpful. Please leave a like and subscribe if you want more of these deep dives, and leave comments to suggest more stuff that I could look into. I'm always open to going wherever people want to go. So, thanks for watching. See you next time.